Given that background, we've been exploring in various conversations what are options to kind of filling this funding gap that Timo was just pointing out, to actually make this investments in the transition and transformation possible across Europe at European scale. And one option that makes sense to us would be to use a climate contribution to fill this funding gap. And the idea behind it is,
Karsten, you're gone on mute, if you could.
Ah, sorry. Yes. Could you move one animation forward, please? So the climate contribution is levied on the production of basic materials like steel, cement, pulp and paper, basic chemicals at the level which is calculated by the benchmark for this material and the carbon price. So effectively, the volume of free allowances that are currently granted for free to these producers for the emissions will be levied as a climate contribution for the domestic production. One more slide, please. But it would be also levied on imports of these basic materials. And as it is structurally an excise charge, it can be waived when these materials are being exported. As it is very simply linked to the weight of the material in products, it can also easily be traced domestically and internationally along the value chain. One slide further, please. And therefore, it could also be levied as an import levy when on imports, when they are produced further down the value chain, and waived on the export there as well. That means with this levy, one effectively creates resources and revenues to fill the funding gap precisely at the scale of free allowance allocation that is not received because of the continued free allocation until 2035. At the same time, it makes basic materials more expensive in comparison to, for example, being creative in using better materials or lower shares of materials. So it gives incentives to material efficiency, substitution, and also for local recycling. And it does so without creating any carbon leakage risk. Next slide, please. So we've looked in a lot of details for the implementation, both the Research Consortium of Climate Strategies, but also in a lot of work for DG Taxud, the European actor on this side, and showed how it can be implemented using existing procedures and practices from excise. The liability for imports can be easily calculated because importers just have to report how much steel, how much cement clinker, how much plastic is in the product. You don't need to trace precisely where it was done, how it was done. So it's not going as extensive internationally, which is, I think, very important. And we can use de minimis rules calculated for which trade categories. We have 3,500 product categories where importers report what type of product it is. And only for 800 or 900 products, you would actually require the importers to report the weight of these materials, because for the other products, the basic material component is really small and insignificant. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, the simple approach would still have a significant share of revenue. So we estimated at the current carbon price of this would be above 80 euro, but assume it would be 80 euro, you would roughly get a bit more than 50 billion euro revenue at the European scale. And you see, this revenue is largest on steel because that's where the biggest carbon intensive factor is, but also aluminum, plastic, pulp and paper, and cement could be easily covered from the mechanisms and dynamics that is being captured here. And it is levied both on domestically produced steel, aluminum, plastics, as much as on the imported materials. And some of the domestic produced and some of the imported materials are exported again, so it's waived for that part, and we calculated this here as well. So it's just the net revenues that would remain for use at European scale. And it can then be discussed how much of this would be used to fund activities at European scale. 50 billion per year is a lot of money. How much would be going back to member states, and what share of this we would like to use to support global climate action, to work together with emerging economies, developing countries, to also make sure they can move to climate neutral production processes. Next slide, please. Obviously, with any such levy, public acceptance is a challenge and will need to be assessed very carefully. A key component that came out from various conversations also with households and their representatives is effectively that it's important to make clear what is the purpose and how is it done. So to show how the revenue will be productively invested to make the industrial transformation possible, to effectively modernize our industry and give us a future prospect by making products from that industry slightly more expensive. So it's actually funded by the activities. It also could be reported to other actors that are particularly emphasizing carbon pricing, that we only fill the carbon pricing gap, make the carbon price signal effectively have the same price implications as if we would have a full shift to auctioning already now at a global scale. The effect of such an approach, we estimated looking at that time at a 30 euro carbon price. So you just need to multiply the numbers at the left side by a factor 2.5 if you want to get the cost increases or the higher expenditures different household segments would have with such a climate contribution. The first decile is the very poorest 10% of the household. The 10th decile is the 10% households with the highest income. And you can see that at this example in Germany, the poorest households would have a cost increase at 80 euros of 0.3 or 0.4%, the richest household of 0.5% of the income for the materials and all the products that they're buying, which reflect then ultimately climate contributions as well. It's one of the only areas where carbon pricing is progressive, which means higher income households spend a bigger share of their income on this, and we don't have huge discrepancies across household segments. So actually, probably the area where effective carbon pricing is most easily implementable from a policy perspective, because on electricity or heating, there's far tougher distribution aspects to be considered as well. Next slide, please. Now, how does it fit with what we just agreed at the European scale on the ETS reform and the CBAM? So as Timo already pointed out at the beginning, at the moment, we have an emissions trading system, which is intended to increase the cost of production with conventional stuff, to make incentives for efficient production, to shift to clean processes and do anything along the value chain. But until 2035, the largest share of allowances are continued to be allocated for free. Next slide, please. Which implies that effectively this carbon price signal from the conventional production is muted. We see that the only way you can get investments in clean processes is by offering them carbon contracts for differences to cover the incremental costs, as are now tendered in Germany, are implemented in the Netherlands and discussed in France to some extent, in the countries which have the fiscal space to do so. Now, the climate contribution would be added to the system. Next slide, please. In a way that it would re-establish this carbon price that is muted through the free allocation along the value chain and ensure that the resources are there for carbon contracts for differences and other transformational investments. And all of this in a manner that avoids carbon leakage risk. So next slide, please. So let me summarize this approach from an international perspective. It could be done at the national level for construction industry or cars in a complex manner, but sometimes countries want to implement something early on. But I think it would make most sense to implement it at the European scale, because most industrial activities are pursued there. That's where our trade activities work as well. And it could be implemented, therefore, as an environmental regulation to enhance the effectiveness of the carbon price signal with qualified majority voting. And you see the reference down there in terms of assessments from a legal side. Internationally, such an approach would not raise any eyebrows under WTO approaches. It's an excise structure which is fully in line with other excises that have been implemented and are very effective globally. It helps to make carbon pricing consistent, and therefore, in a way, actually helps us in Europe on the WTO side, because we still are vulnerable with our continued free allocation from various WTO challenges. And with this approach, we show that there's a consistency in this carbon pricing system, where ultimately the free allocation is part of the overall part. It could also help internationally, because we do need to work together internationally to help particularly emerging economies in developing countries to make their new investments in a climate neutral manner. That does raise incremental costs, and I think that is a very strong case, particularly on these incremental costs, for clean production to serve domestic markets to get international support. And here would be a manner to kind of raise some of the funding for this. And it's a system that we've explored with climate strategies, could be, and our partners internationally, in a similar manner implemented in other regions of the world. So it's an opportunity to move forward globally on an effective policy for decarbonization of industry.